Hi, Thais. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here with you.
All right, start by telling us who you are, what you do, and why you chose to focus your work on personal development.
So I basically run a program called the Personal Development School. I've written over 65 courses. And in there we have students that come in. We've had about 40,000 people come through. And they do a lot of work on everything from career related things like how to communicate and work through conflict communication or set boundaries in the workplace to a particular focus around attachment styles. So I basically got into that work because first of all, everybody has an attachment style. And second of all, our attachment styles really affect us in all of our 7 areas of life. They affect our patterns and what we believe about ourselves in regards to career, around money, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, relationships. Like it really spills out into everything because really what our attachment style determines more than anything is the relationship we have to ourselves, what we believe about ourselves, how we think and feel about ourselves. And so when we can actually make sure that we understand that part of ourselves very deeply, it spills into everything else. And I originally was a fearful avoidant attachment style. So I had a lot of the different challenges and different things going on. And so it was really useful for me to learn to, reprogram my limiting beliefs and learn my needs and my boundaries and how to communicate more effectively in the world. And that really benefited me in so many different ways. I wanted to share that with others.
I'm curious, we're going to get deeper into attachment styles, obviously, on the show, but if you decide that your attachment style is not working for you, can you change it?
Yes. And I think that's one of
Okay.
the things that, like, it's almost like the biggest mistake people make is they think, oh, this is my attachment style. I'm anxious or I'm fearful avoidant or I'm dismissive. And then they go, okay, so this is me. And
Yeah,
the reality is it's really a subconscious set of rules that you've been conditioned to believe, right? So we have these ideas about what attachment looks like to other people, how relationships should look. And they're all just these pre-existing ideas we have, but all of those things are changeable. And I think that that's not a focus area enough for people is that we can actually rewire these things. It's not a diagnosis or a disorder. You're not born with this either. So it's not genetic. It happens through conditioning, and we can leverage principles of neuroplasticity to actually recondition.
I think too, what's happened over recent years is we've gotten this message of like, bring your authentic self to work. And I think the message has been like twisted a little bit. It's like the game of telephone. By the time it's made it through to people, I think the message they have is like, well, this is just who I am. If you can't work with me, like that's your problem. And so I think, one of the things I've seen people struggle with is sort of they're like, but I'm being authentic. I'm like, but it almost feels like not an excuse, but like an explanation for being unwilling to change or being unwilling to say, is there a way to have, to for this to be better for me and for the people I work with? So I like your point about like it things can change. You're not sort of like, the way you respond to stuff can be better for you and for maybe the other person, for an example. I think again, like we've heard this, be your authentic self, and I think that message got kind of tangled up in the end.
100%. And I think, being authentic, like we can share like our true characteristics and traits in the workplace and express ourselves in a way that's like in alignment with what we need and what we want. But I also think like the workplace is the professional environment and we do just like anything, we have to tailor ourselves to be able to move into that environment and thrive. And sometimes we have to also be mindful of other people or the environment we're in, just like we would try to be mindful of somebody we're in a close relationship to. And so it definitely goes both ways there.
Okay, I want to start with just like the history of attachment theory. I'm sure could be like a huge long episode in itself, but so can you briefly explain this?
Definitely. So attachment theory was originally developed by John Bowlby and then later sort of iterated on by Mary Ainsworth. And he was out of Cambridge University. And basically what happened is they discovered there are four attachment styles. And you can think of your attachment style as being the subconscious set of rules you have for how to relate to others. So if you imagine that, everyone has an attachment style, there's four of them, and you have a different attachment style than somebody else, it's almost as an analogy, like sitting down and trying to play a board game with somebody, and one person has the rules for Scrabble and the other person has the rules for Monopoly. Like there's just going to be a lot of unnecessary miscommunications and friction and boundary violations and like confusion. So it's really useful for us to recognize what our attachment style is and then try to get some insight into the attachment styles of people close to us, whether it's people we work closely with or we're spending a lot of time around on a regular basis, because that gives us insight into like what their needs tend to be, what their expectations tend to be. So of the four, attachment styles. The first one is securely attached. Generally, these children, they get a lot of approach-oriented behaviors as children in childhood. And so what they'll have is a lot of like, they if they cry or express emotion, the parents will go towards them, will try to soothe them. So they basically get a lot of conditioning around, okay, I should express my feelings and needs. It's safe to rely on other people. It's safe to communicate to other people. And as a result of that, as they get older, they also learn to be better communicators and hold space for others. And generally, they have the least amount of conflict statistically in relationships. They tend to resolve conflict in the fastest period of time, and they tend to be much better communicators because they have really healthy modeling for communication growing up. Then you have three other attachment styles that are insecurely attached. And they often go through some form of like little t or big T attachment trauma, perhaps a combination of both. But the anxious attachment style basically grows up in a household where there's a lot of inconsistency. So there can be a really warm parent and a really cold parent. Then there's this feeling of like, oh my goodness, I feel this emotional disconnect when I'm with one parent or the other. Or another variation could be the parents are very loving, but they work a lot. So there's a lot of love is there when the parents are home, but then it's taken away because they're back with the grandparents or the babysitter after school programs. So there's this like repetitive perceived abandonment. And this causes this individual to have these really big abandonment wounds. They get conditioned into them through repetition or firing and wiring over time. And so all of a sudden, this person grows up as an adult and they end up quite anxious in their relationships. And you'll see the anxious attachment style specifically in the workplace. They tend to really fear being excluded or disliked. They tend to people please a ton at work because they're really worried about being rejected in some sort of way. And they have a lot of abandonment wounds that they'll bring in. And what that looks like in the workplace setting is they're afraid of being cut loose, right? They're afraid of, oh, I make a mistake, I'm going to be fired or let go. And so they have a lot of these concerns. And you'll generally find these individuals, they work really well in teams. They tend to be very conscientious of other people, really good at bringing people together. But sometimes they can put themselves on a trajectory towards burnout because they constantly self-sacrifice at the expense really of themselves to please and make sure other people are feeling okay and comfortable. So that's the anxious. Flip side is the dismissive avoidant attachment style. They're pretty much the opposite in a lot of ways. They grow up with childhood emotional neglect as like the overarching theme. And sometimes there can be a little bit um, very overt neglect where food's not even on the table. Parents are just missing all the time, have a lot of their own issues, but the vast majority of the time it's very covert, it's very subtle. So you'll see instead that this person grows up and they might have structure in their life and there might be not very much fighting in the house, but this child never grows up with emotional nurturing. So they never get like attunement. If they cry or express emotion, it's often dismissed or ignored. So they think, oh, my emotions are basically unworthy and it makes me defective or something's wrong with me if I try to express myself emotionally because it's constantly met in a negative way. And so they instead grow up and what they basically do is they go, well, I'm just not going to need anything from anybody. And that's how I'll keep myself feeling safe because I just feel when I do try to rely on someone emotionally, it's rejected. So at work, as adults, you'll see dismissive avoidance become hyper independent. Often they struggle to ask for help or support. They try to do everything themselves. They often tend to be the ones that silo themselves out more and actually kind of prefer not to work with other people in groups, even if they're okay at it. Sometimes we'll see them even soothe through their work. So they'll become workaholics as a way of sort of distracting themselves from their own emotions. And they can be very logical, practical, thorough, very hardworking, very autonomous, very good at getting things done. There's so many benefits and drawbacks to each. But overall, that's generally what you'll see in the dismissive avoidant. And then very last but not least, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you to repeat them. So say the fourth one, then we'll name all four of them again.
Okay, perfect. And
Yeah.
the fourth one is the fearful avoidant, sometimes referred to as the disorganized. So basically, the fearful avoidant grows up with a lot of chaos. They tend to statistically have more big T trauma than the other attachment styles. There could be like abuse in the home, or it could be things like a really bad divorce, parents an alcoholic, or has a personality disorder. But basically, what you'll see is this child grows up in an environment where it's like you never know what you're gonna get. So some days, let's just use the example of a parent who's an alcoholic. Some days, you may see that let's say it's mom and mom's drinking and she's in a great mood and she's nice. Other days, mom's drinking and she's in a terrible mood and she's cruel. Other days, mom's sobering up and she feels guilty and she's nice. Other days, she's sobering up and going through withdrawals and she's totally unavailable. So it's like you don't know what version of somebody you're going to get. And this when we try to attach to somebody and like learn how to relate to somebody, what happens is this person grows up to just become extremely hypervigilant. They notice everything. Like little micro expression change, they notice that they pick up on it. And so, on one side, we'll tend to see somebody who's scared to trust. They don't really trust their environment. They're kind of always waiting for the other shoe to drop. They notice every little incongruency everywhere. They can often be kind of suspicious, but they also tend to be really deep and want a lot of depth. And they tend to be, they usually have to grow up fast. And so they tend to be really good at surviving and thriving outside of their comfort zone. And they tend to be extremely hardworking if they find something they like. They may be rebellious to authority because they usually had negative experiences with authority. So they may find themselves like with their boss or things like that, like trying to sort of reject if anybody makes them feel controlled or trapped. Um, but they do tend to really care about people. They want connection, but they're also kind of afraid of it at the same time. So they're often quite hot and cold in their
Yeah.
workplace relationships. But they can be really good, honestly, entrepreneurs a lot of the time because they're used to rolling with the punches and being outside of their comfort zone and having to figure things out that they would never have to figure out, or most people wouldn't try to figure out because that's like the comfort zone of their childhood. Like you're totally operating outside of your comfort zone, grow up fast, figure it out as you go. And so a lot of their personality actually fits well into those types of situations as adults.
Yeah, the like more risky, you're not totally sure what you're getting career.
Yeah.
This is so interesting. It sounded like, okay, wait. So first tell us the four names of them again, because these were incredible explanations, but I just want to go over the four, what they're called.
Yeah, so secure, and they tend to be very even keeled, good communicators, healthy childhood, pretty healthy in the workplace. Anxious, they tend to be very loving, sweet, charismatic with people, but super afraid of being rejected. So they become very people pleasing. Dismissive avoidant, pretty much the opposite of that. They tend to be very independent. They grow up with neglect. And so they kind of decide, okay, I'm just not going to need anything from anybody. They can be very hardworking, very mental, very, intelligent, practical, very disconnected from their emotions as a general rule. And fearful avoidant, the rolling with the punches, grow up fast, operate outside of your comfort zone, figure it out on your feet, kind of personalities. And they can have a lot of emotion. They tend to feel a lot at the same time.
I'm so the first one, secure, sounds like the best, but also how do we determine what we are? I mean, some people I'm sure listening to this, I know I was able to sort of like naturally identify listening to the explanations, which one I feel most
Which
like.
one was it?
What's that?
Which one was it?
I think I was a mix between anxious and secure.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah,
That's really
yeah, because I'm like very empathetic, like almost too high of empathy. Like I'm very concerned with other people's feelings, and that can be like to a detriment. And I was going to ask you, can you be a combination of the both of two of them? Yes,
exactly.
okay, okay,
Yes.
that,
So
that makes more sense.
most people will be able to recognize just from hearing like sort of the childhood and upbringing and then the sort of big fears like the abandonment fears versus like
Yeah,
the dismissal when a lot of their fears are around being like shamed or trapped or having to work with other people and it not being, a good fit for them. Like a lot of those are the fears and fearful avoidance, theirs are around being trapped or betrayed, like the other shoe drops, those sorts of
yeah.
things. So people can usually like hear from there. We do have like a free attachment style quiz on our website. People can actually answer like 30
Oh, we'll
questions
put that in the show notes
determine.
then.
Yeah, some
Yeah.
new ones go deeper and it'll tell you about the different dynamics. But the best way is to sort of hear it first, and most people will tend to really resonate. And you can absolutely be a mix of two. So you can for sure have we call it like a leaning, right? So you can have like mostly a secure environment, but maybe at times your parents were working a lot, just as an example. And there was a little bit of that anxiety, a little bit of that fearing abandonment. It may not be the same as somebody who has very loving parents, but they often have to travel for work for weeks at a time.
Yeah.
And a lot more of that abandonment in there. But based on like the basically neural pathways get formed through repetition plus emotion. So the more emotional something is, the deeper it will impact us. And the more repetitive it is, the more it will impact us in terms of our wiring. So you can see a range of like what somebody's attachment style would be based on like maybe you had mostly secure wiring, but then you had a little bit of repetition and a little bit of high level
Yeah.
emotion, the anxious, whereas somebody else might have really intense anxious wiring, not really much secure modeling. And so that will impact their wiring a lot more in that case.
Well, and I'll just use myself as the guinea pig. I feel like, so when I was 12, we moved from California to Florida, and it was like very traumatic because it was like I had this very secure upbringing. My parents were married, the whole good, like, normal thing. And then I came home one day and like the house was for sale. We were moving to Florida. When we moved to Florida, like my dad was working in Seattle. And so like I feel like that's why I say I'm like kind of this half-half, because it happened later in life, but I had like this very secure. So I was like, I it's not that moving was so bad or my parents were bad people. I think it was just sort of I was so used to a secure repetition, to your point. And when you're 12 and you're the new kid in school, trust me, that like you remember that feeling. So but I do want to ask you, because like, for example, I'm a working mom, like I do have to travel sometimes, or my kids do have to be with a caretaker. So someone listening to this, and then we'll get into sort of like how to rewire your attachment style. Someone listening to this might be worried. Like my initial worry was like, oh my gosh, are my kids going to have a secure attachment style if I have to work and I can't always be there? Like, I'm sure you've heard this from other working parents, this fear. What can we do to help make sure our kids are secure?
That's a great question. I just want to comment very briefly on what you said. So at 12 years old, you went and you moved. And that's like a perfect example of context, right? Generally, between the ages of 0 to 8, we're the most impressionable. We're the most suggestible. Like, based on, we're producing mostly alpha brain waves. So we're kind of in like this light state of almost hypnosis, somebody with a background in hypnotherapy. So we're really taking all of our programming in at a much deeper and more rapid pace. Whereas later in life, we can still be imprinted, but 12 years old won't be as, something that affects you as much. But that would be like a perfect example for anybody listening. Oh, okay, that might have been what made me mostly secure, but with this anxious side to me. So, and then when it comes to children, part of what wounds the attachment style, right? Like what creates the attachment style, it can really boil down to two major areas. One is the actual core wounds we adopt. So the abandonment wound, the not good enough wound, the exclusion core wound. So we'll tend to have these wounds based on those experiences of repetition and emotion that imprint us. And just as a parent, starting off with the wound part, we can do something to communicate to its opposite. And if we repeatedly communicate to its opposite, so let's say, for example, you're a mother, you travel for work. When you travel for work, make sure that you're reinforcing things like, hey, I know I have to travel, but I'm going to come back and I can't wait to see you. And, I'm going to be really excited to spend time together. You matter so much to me. Like the more we can communicate, the opposite of abandonment is connection. So the more we can communicate about how we care about connection, value the connection, we will maintain the connection, we'll pour into the connection when we're back. It actually does the opposite of wiring in that imprint of abandonment. So that can be one really great place to start first. The second piece is our needs. So we tend to have needs, and the anxious attachments needs, if you're worried about that as a parent who's working, one of the big needs are things like reassurance, validation, acknowledgement, being made to feel special or prioritized. So as a parent, that could look like being really encouraging with your children, really acknowledging them and making them feel like seen and recognized in how they are. And I want to be really clear here. You would want to stay away from like acknowledging them for things that they're doing, like making good grades, and instead for the characteristics of who they are as a human, like their empathy or their sweet spirit or how kind and thoughtful they are. Like that's really what makes somebody feel deeply seen and loved. And the last part is you can do things where you're making them a priority. Like, hey, mom's going to go away for a little bit to work, but when I come back, we're going to have a fun time going to the park together for an hour. Or we're going to like make a special evening just for me and you. And so all of those things are basically doing the opposite of wiring in these fears of abandonment and then also not having those needs met. And those are two big parts of making sure we reprogram, because how these things happen in the first place, repetition and emotion fires and wires neural pathways. So if we can do the opposite things in that short period of time, we see the needle move.
Yeah, okay, I'm following this. Like, it's like a counterbalance effect kind of thing. Like, you would be in the negative, but you're going to end up breaking even because of that behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Perfectly said.
Okay, so I love that. I like love this kind of stuff, and I'm very curious. And I like, again, I was thinking about, based on some people I've worked with in the past, like, can you identify their attachment style? I'm sure people listening to this again can start to identify this in certain people they work with. So let's just focus on ourselves though, because we can't make other people interested in this topic. If you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I recognize this in myself, I would like to sort of change my attachment style so it is more secure. I think it would be good for me, but it would also be good for probably my surroundings. Like what are the steps you take?
Great question. So just like we talked about what you would do with kids in a very simplified way, you would be doing that with yourself. So one of the funniest things that happens is whatever our attachment wounds are, we re-wound ourselves. And this is because our subconscious comfort zone is this. So like you
Yeah.
can see the thread, right? For anybody who's newer to this idea, I can tell you already get it, but for anybody listening, like let's just use a really easy example. You grew up in a home with two very critical parents. Let's say they think that they're just priming you for the world and preparing you for the world, but then you make that mean, oh, I'm not good enough. So you grew up with all this criticism. Well, repetition and emotion fires and wires your neural pathways, which means the relationship you have to yourself, which means guess what you're going to do as an adult? You're going to go out into the world and you're going to be super self-critical because that's your zone of familiarity. And so what we first have to do is we have to stop reenacting the wounds in the relationship to ourselves. You'll see with an anxious person, people who are truly anxiously attached, and you may have some of this too, but probably lesser. Um, People who are truly anxiously attached, they self-abandon like crazy, right? They constantly reenact those wounds in the relationship to self, put everybody else first, put themselves last. Who cares about their needs? Who cares about their feelings? Violate their own boundaries to people please everyone else. Like they're self-abandoning, right? They're reenacting their attachment wounds in relationship to self. So the first thing we do is we recognize those wounds, right? And we make sure that we're practicing doing the opposite. We're firing and wiring the opposite. We're counterbalancing. So if you're fearful avoidant, one of the big things that happens is fearful avoidants tend to take advantage of themselves to please others as well, and they violate their own trust by showing up kind of as like a chameleon in different ways, right? And they have this dynamic of also having that anxious side, like the people pleasing side, but also having the avoidance side, being afraid of being trapped. So fearful avoidance, like part of their healing becomes set better boundaries, learn to communicate your needs, actually show up more as your authentic self, like we were talking about earlier, but that doesn't mean, who cares what I'm supposed to be doing in the workplace? I just feel like doing this. It means like making sure that you get into a career that's aligned with something that is meaningful to you, that you're introspective about what kind of work you want to be doing. So we do the opposite of our core wounds. And for dismissive avoidance, what that often looks like is they tend to shame themselves all the time. When you're emotionally neglected as a child, the child doesn't have the capacity to be like, oh, my parents are emotionally unavailable. Children personalize everything. So they go, something must be wrong with me that I can't get my emotional needs met. This part of me emotionally is wrong. So they neglect themselves and their own emotions and they shame themselves for having them. And we have to do the opposite. We have to start being more accepting to ourselves around those things. We have to make sure that we're actually making space for our emotions and getting back in touch with them because they'll direct us in terms of what we should be doing next. It's so interesting. Dismissive avoidants often end up in careers that are totally out of alignment with what they want. Like that's a very common theme for dismissive avoidance because if you don't know what you feel, it's hard to identify what you're really wanting.
I was thinking those are the people who probably end up in those like the Wall Street jobs where you have to like sell your soul, work 90 hours a week, and they're like, I have no emotions, so it doesn't. I'm not like internalizing this. It's not even funny, but it's like I'm like, yeah, I can understand what type of
It's
careers they get into, you know?
totally the truth. Totally the truth. That, or like you'll see them in like the big engineering careers where they're very mental and very intellectual, but less emotionally based because it's a comfort zone. So, and sometimes that can be a great fit for them, but sometimes it'll also be like, no, I just should be successful, run full speed ahead into a career I don't even like and regret it later. So we do the opposite of how we were wounded. That's a really big first step. And the second step is you want to ask yourself, well, what are my big needs? What am I needing for other people all the time? And how can I make sure that I learn to meet those needs in the relationship to myself? And as we rewire those things, that's how, if for example, for an anxious attachment style, if they're needing reassurance from others, they need to be giving themselves reassurance or validation
Mm.
or encouragement. If they need to be made a priority to others, they need to learn to prioritize time with themselves sometimes to do what they need to recharge or recuperate. So all the things we're needing from others, we need to give to self. All the things we got from our family system that we didn't like, that we're wounded by, we need to do the opposite of to self. And those are two really big steps that will move the needle.
So it's almost like step one, determine your attachment style, then determine your core wounds and then your core needs and sort of adjust. And so I guess once a person maybe they've done the work to sort of recognize this, that obviously they can take the quiz on your website, but like once they do this work, is this something where you journal this? Like how tactically do you put this into practice to like rewire that subconscious mind? And I really related to like the not good enough thing. Like, you didn't do as well on an interview as you thought you should. And so that inner critic just goes at you. And I remember we had Kristen Neff on the podcast who wrote the book about self-compassion. And she was like, self-compassion is the antidote to being having your inner critic, whereas a lot of people think it's self-esteem. But self-esteem is like, you're the best, get back out there, you're going to be amazing. Like, look at all the things you've done in the past that have been amazing. Whereas self-compassion is being kind to yourself. So to your point, it's the opposite of the inner critic. So I guess I'm kind of curious, like, what is the day-to-day action look like of rewiring and reprogramming that?
Okay, so really great question. There's actually so many ways we can go about it. I'll share a tool that I really, really love. So it's called auto suggestion belief reprogramming. It's very powerful and it works in a fairly short period of time relative to how long we might have been carrying these wounds. So what we do is we first have to recognize that like all of these wounds are subconscious. Nobody wakes up and consciously says, I'm going to tell
Right.
myself I'm not good enough all day. Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what
exactly.
happens. And so we have these subconscious wounds, and so we have to target the problem where it exists. Now, the subconscious mind doesn't speak language. That's why I'm not a big fan of affirmations, because affirmations are all language. I am good enough. I am good enough. I am good enough. You get repetition, but you don't get much emotion, and you definitely don't speak in the language of the subconscious. A way you can tell how the subconscious speaks is if I say, whatever you do not think of a chocolate chip cookie. Like you say do not, and your conscious mind hears the reasoning, the logical part. Oh yes, I should not do that. But then you flash the image of a chocolate chip cookie.
Yeah.
So your subconscious speaks in emotion and imagery. Now, if you want to say, okay, so now I know I need to speak in emotion and imagery to my subconscious mind, and obviously I know I want to do the opposite of the core wound. Well, how do I find emotion and imagery? Well, every single memory we ever have, it's actually just emotion and imagery. So if I were to say, tell me your favorite childhood memory, you might say, oh, I was playing on the playground. You'd see the images of the playground. You'd tell the story. You'd start smiling. You'd feel the emotions attached to that experience. So all memories are a container for emotions and images. So now we're like, okay, well, if I have a not good enough core wound, I need the opposite. And then I need 10 memories of when I felt and experienced the opposite. And so what we're doing is we're making sure the self-compassion part's really beautiful and powerful and goes a long way for that wound, but it won't necessarily reprogram all wounds, right? The abandonment wound and things like that. And so what we're actually looking for is not to just have the self-compassion reactively, like, oh, I'm being unkind to myself. Now I better be compassionate. No, no, no. I'm going to try to make sure that internal dialogue of being unkind to begin with is wiped out once and for all. And what we do is we kind of pluck the weed out at its root, right? We're like, okay, I'm going to really make sure that the not good enough wound is not a part of my programming anymore. And so what we do is we have, I'm not good enough. What's the opposite? Step one, I am good enough. We find the opposite of the wound we want to work on. Step two, we find 10, because 10 gives us a repetition for the firing and wiring, pieces of memory where we were good enough. And we can pick things that are more about our character rather than like, I got a good grade. We can pick things that are more about our truth, right? It's the ultimate self-acceptance. It's like, I'm good enough because truly when no one's watching, I show up as this type of person. I show up as this friend. I show up as this parent. I try my hardest in this way at work. And so what we do is we find 10 memories of the opposite of the core wound. And then what we do, step three, is we just record it. And then we listen back to it and really try to see it in the images and feel about those memories for 21 days. And research shows us it takes 21 days to build new, really deep neural pathways, enough where we actually rewire old programming. And neural pathways are kind of like muscles. They atrophy over time. So, if you stop working out your bicep, your muscle goes away. So, we plug that in that same way where we say, okay, well, I'm just not going to refeed this pattern. I'm going to feed in this way of thinking, feeling, seeing myself through the repetition, emotion, and imagery. 21 days of listening back to that once a day in the morning or evening. This can really rewire as long as we're present and as long as we're really feeling and seeing those images and emotions.
So like record yourself telling the 10 memories, like remember when you were on the playground when you were 3 and you were selling lemonade or whatever it is. And okay, awesome. I love that. I think that's so good. And also I mean, I'm a big podcast person. I like to listen to stuff. And I think there's, something really nice about you could make this like a walking meditation or something you do, or like, I work from home, but one of the things I haven't done it recently, but I want to get back into is I would do these like pre-commute to my desk where I would like walk for 10 or 15 minutes. And so anyway, I'm just giving people ideas of how they could fit this into their day. But I love this. I'm personally very interested in sort of, well, I like career development, which naturally leads into liking personal development. And one of the things that, you know, I do think systems and structures are absolutely broken, especially for women and minorities and people with disabilities. But that's like a whole other thing. But sometimes it's like, yes, we have to work on that. But also, I love it when you're able to kind of recognize things in yourself and, why not go through life with a more secure attachment style? Like that's the way I look at this is like, well, that would be a win-win for me no matter what. Yes, I still have the structure and the systems that are working against me, but this is something that you can do for yourself. And we had a woman come on and talk about like real self-care versus like wellness self-care. And I throw this into the bucket of like real self-care, really rewiring that. Wow, this has been like incredibly interesting and just like a learning experience. So, where can people, like, if they want to go deeper into this topic, where can they, find your resources, follow you, tell them everything, and repeat the quiz because we'll put that in the show notes too.
Okay, perfect. So I put daily content out on YouTube. So personal development school dash Thais Gibson, THAIS. And then at personaldevelopmentschool.com, you can take that attachment style quiz. You just click attachment quiz at the top. It'll show you all of your breakdown of your attachment styles. To your point, if you have like a bit of a blend between secure and anxious, things like that, it'll actually help break that down for you. And then it tells you all of your different core wounds and gives you a place to actually start with reprogramming. So you get like a free report that gives you some tools and also a really big breakdown about what's going on there and what you can do differently.
Thais, I love it. Thank you so much for joining the show, and we'll put all of those links in the show notes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.